The glass hit the marble floor before she even finished the sentence. Vivian Hartwell stood in the center of a penthouse worth more than most people's entire lives, watching the man she loved transform into something she didn't recognize, jaw locked, eyes gone cold, the warmth she'd spent months uncovering buried under 7 feet of concrete in under 3 seconds flat. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Nothing she rehearsed prepared her for the silence after the crash. Damian Moretti, the man whose name made lieutenants flinch and rival bosses lose sleep, stood 15 feet away from her like she'd just put a bullet in his chest. And maybe she had, because the word pregnant had done what no enemy ever managed. It had broken him open, deep. If you've been waiting for a story about power, betrayal, and the kind of love that survives 15 years of lies, stay right here. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The appointment had been at 9 in the morning, tucked into a clinic on the north side of Chicago where nobody knew her name and the receptionist behind the frosted window didn't look up when patients walked in. Vivian had preferred it that way. She'd sat in a plastic chair with a paper cup of cold coffee balanced on her knee, watching a wall-mounted television cycle through morning news she couldn't hear, and she'd told herself for the 14th time that week that she was probably wrong. The test she'd taken in her bathroom 3 days earlier had been wrong before. She'd read about it online. False positives happened. Cheap tests were unreliable. Stress could mess with hormones in ways that produced numbers that meant nothing. She told herself all of that at 6 in the morning with the lights off, sitting on the edge of her tub with her phone screen the only source of light in the room. She told herself all of it again while driving to the clinic. She was still telling herself while the technician typed something into a keyboard and turned the monitor and showed her an image that looked like static, like noise, like nothing, except for the small pulsing shape at the center of it that was absolutely, undeniably, terrifyingly real. 8 weeks, the technician said. A young woman with a calm, professional tone who clearly understood that this particular patient needed facts, not warmth. Everything looks normal, strong. Vivian nodded. She didn't cry. She was very deliberate about that. She pressed her back teeth together and stared at the ceiling and breathed through her nose until the urge to fall completely apart had passed. And then she sat up, and she thanked the woman, and she drove herself home in near-perfect silence with one hand on the wheel and one hand pressed flat against her stomach. Her apartment was a clean, spare 2-bedroom on the 6th floor of a building that didn't have a doorman or a concierge or any of the things she'd grown accustomed to over the past 8 months. She had deliberately chosen that. After Damian's world, she needed something that was entirely her own. Walls she'd painted herself, furniture she'd assembled with instructions she didn't fully understand, a coffee maker that she alone had chosen from a store that sold only coffee makers. On a Tuesday afternoon, alone because she could, she sat on her couch for 4 hours without moving. The November light slid across the floor as the afternoon died. The radiator knocked. Somewhere below her, a child was practicing the piano. The same 8-bar phrase over and over, never quite getting the timing right in the third measure, always stumbling in the same place. Vivian sat there and listened to that child stumble, and she thought about Damian Moretti. She thought about the way she'd first met him, at a zoning commission meeting of all places, where he'd arrived with 2 lawyers and an architectural rendering of a proposed development near the South Loop, and she'd been presenting the competing design, commissioned by a nonprofit housing organization that couldn't afford the kind of legal firepower he'd brought. She'd expected him to be dismissive, the way powerful men were dismissive, politely, with expensive watches and bored eyes. Instead, he'd listened. He'd asked her a specific question about her load-bearing calculations that nobody at a zoning meeting had ever asked her before, and she'd answered it, and he'd nodded like the answer was exactly what he'd expected. 3 weeks later, an envelope had appeared on her firm's front desk. Inside was a contract to redesign the interior of a commercial building his subsidiary owned near Wacker Drive. No note, no phone number, just a contract and a figure that had made her senior partner grab the desk for support. She told herself it was professional. She told herself that for approximately 2 months. The first time Damian Moretti had kissed her, it had been in the parking garage beneath his building on a cold Wednesday night, after a site meeting that had run long. while rain hammered the concrete outside the entrance and water dripped from the ceiling in 3 separate places. He'd walked her to her car, the way he'd done twice before under the pretense of reviewing drawings. She'd opened her door, turned back to say goodnight, and found him closer than expected. And the thing she remembered most was that he hadn't moved fast. He'd given her every opportunity to step back. He'd watched her face like he was reading a document, looking for some clause that would stop him. She hadn't given him one. 8 months. 8 months of learning a man who revealed himself in fragments, never in whole, never easily, always at a price she paid in patience. 8 months of watching him operate inside a world she understood intellectually but never fully accepted. She was not naive about what Damien Moretti was. She was an architect who dealt in structural reality. She could not pretend a building was safe when the foundation was cracked, and she could not pretend Damien was a legitimate businessman when she had seen, on 4 separate occasions, men come to his penthouse at 11 at night and leave at 1 in the morning looking like they'd been told something they couldn't unhear. She'd asked him once, directly, in bed, at 2 in the morning, when the city was quiet and his guard was down farther than it usually went. "Tell me how far it goes." He'd been quiet for a long time. She'd watched the ceiling. He'd watched the ceiling. "Far enough that you shouldn't ask me again," he'd finally said. She'd let it rest, not because she was afraid, because she understood, architecturally, structurally, that some load-bearing elements couldn't be removed without bringing the whole building down. And Damien's silence on certain things was one of those elements. She'd accepted that. She'd drawn her own interior walls around it. She'd also, apparently, made a child with him. Vivian pressed her palm harder against her stomach and looked at the ceiling of her apartment. The child downstairs stumbled in the 3rd measure again. She didn't call first. She understood instinctively that calling would allow him to prepare, would allow Damien to build himself into the appropriate shape before she arrived, and she needed to see him without the shape. She needed the version that hadn't had time to construct itself. She drove to his building on Michigan Avenue at 6:47 in the evening, after the dinner-hour rush of the lobby, when the concierge recognized her face and waved her past without comment because she'd been here often enough in the past 8 months that her arrival was unremarkable. She took the elevator to the 34th floor. She stood outside his door for almost 2 full minutes, listening to the muffled sound of a television and the distant sound of the city below. And then she knocked. He opened it himself. He was in a dark gray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading glasses pushed to the top of his head, a small, human detail that still made her breath catch, because Damien Moretti with reading glasses looked momentarily, remarkably, like a man who read things and got tired at night and had a softness somewhere in him. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, barely touched. Behind him, the penthouse was lit warmly, the city sprawling beyond floor-to-ceiling windows in ribbons of amber and silver. He looked at her face, and the warmth in his eyes shifted into something more careful. "You didn't call," he said. "No." He stepped back and let her in. She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of his living room, which she had always found slightly too large to feel like a home, and she turned toward him, and she said it without the preamble she'd planned, without the careful architecture of explanation she'd built around it, because the moment she was standing in front of him, the structure fell apart. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then the glass left his hand. She flinched at the sound, not the throw. She didn't even see him release it, only heard the explosion of it against the marble near the wet bar, crystal shattering in a bright, violent burst that scattered across the floor like something alive. The sound filled the room, and then it was over, and the silence that came after was heavier than the one before. Damien stood with his arm still extended from the throw, his hand empty, his face absolutely still. "That's impossible," he said. His voice had no expression in it. That was the part that hit her the hardest. Not the glass, not the word impossible, but the way he said it like a clinical fact, like an entry in a legal record, like something that had been established long ago and required no discussion. Vivian's chest was tight. She kept her voice steady because she had promised herself she would. "It's real. I had an ultrasound this morning. 8 weeks. You heard what I said." "I heard you." She didn't move. "I'm telling you what the doctor showed me." Damien turned away from her. He walked toward the windows, and she watched his reflection materialize in the glass, the city behind him, the fractured mess of the broken crystal on the floor behind her. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, one hand pressed against the window frame, and she watched his shoulder blades move under the fabric of his shirt as he breathed. "I was told," he said quietly, to the glass, to the city, to nowhere in particular, that this wasn't possible for me. I was told that 15 years ago by a physician whose work I had no reason to question. That diagnosis is a documented medical fact. Diagnoses can be wrong. Not this one. Damien, it was not a general assessment. It was not one doctor's opinion. He turned back to her now, and his face was composed in a way that she recognized as dangerous. Not the kind of dangerous that came before violence, but the kind that came before a complete architectural shutdown of feeling. It was extensively documented. It was confirmed by 2 separate specialists. Then one of them was wrong, or the test was wrong, or something changed. I don't know the medicine, Damien. What I know is what that ultrasound showed me this morning, and did anyone else have access to you? The words were flat, stripped of tone, which made them worse. Anyone else before me that fault? Don't. Her voice went cold. She felt the cold move through her like water. Don't say the rest of that sentence. He held her gaze. She saw something working behind his eyes. Not cruelty. She didn't think it was cruelty. She thought it was a kind of desperate arithmetic. A man running numbers that refused to balance. A man who'd been told a fundamental truth about himself so many years ago that to dismantle it now was to dismantle a structural wall that held the rest of the building upright. She understood buildings. She understood what happened when you pulled a structural wall. She understood, looking at him, that he was not rejecting her. He was rejecting the possibility that his foundation had been laid wrong. It didn't make it hurt any less. "I need you to leave," he said. "Damien, please." The word came out rougher than the rest. Something cracked in it, very slightly, like a fault line. I need a moment to think." "I've been thinking for 3 days," she said, alone. He looked at her. She saw the fault line again, wider for a second, the real man right underneath the stone, the man who wore reading glasses and asked smart questions at zoning meetings. Then the stone closed. "Please leave," he said again. She left. She did not cry in the elevator. She cried in her car, parked in his garage, for exactly 6 minutes, timed because she watched the clock on her dashboard, because she needed to know there was a finite amount of time she was allowed to fall apart. Then she drove home. The call that came at 11 that night was from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. When she did, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. A woman, older, professional cadence. "Ms. Hartwell, my name is Catherine Voss. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. Nathaniel Rourke's office. I was informed that you may have been in contact recently with... How did you get this number?" A pause. "I apologize for the hour. I was asked to reach out. There may be some records you should be aware of, relating to a prior medical history. It would be helpful if we could speak in person." Vivian sat up in bed. The room was dark. The city threw pale light through her curtains. "Whose records?" she said carefully. Another pause. "Mr. Moretti's," the woman said. Vivian's hand tightened around her phone. "Who gave you my number?" "I'm afraid I can't say. I understand this seems unusual. If you'd prefer, I can send documentation to an address you specify. But the information is time-sensitive, and I believe it's relevant to the conversation you had this evening." The conversation she'd had this evening. This woman knew what had happened in that penthouse tonight, which meant either Damien had made a call, which Vivian didn't believe, or someone else in that building had ears in places they shouldn't. Neither option was comfortable. "Send it to my firm," Vivian said. "The address is public record." She ended the call. She lay back in her dark bedroom and stared at the ceiling and thought about the word Damien had used. Impossible. The way he'd said it. The way it had come out not as anger but as certainty. The certainty of a man who'd been sitting with a piece of information for 15 years, who'd made his peace with it, who'd built an entire internal architecture around it the way she built buildings, load by load, wall by wall, until the structure was so established you couldn't imagine what had stood in its place before. Someone had told him he couldn't have children. 2 specialists. Documented. Confirmed. She was 8 weeks pregnant with his child. One of those facts was wrong. And whoever had called her at 11 at night from an unknown number with the voice of someone delivering information they'd been waiting to deliver, knew something about which one. But Damien did not sleep. He sat in his darkened living room for a long time after she left. The broken crystals still scattered across the marble, the city beyond the glass going through its indifferent cycles. Traffic thinning, lights shifting, the distant noise of a world that continued functioning regardless of what fell apart inside this room. He was 51 years old. He had built an empire on the ability to read situations accurately, to identify the variable that everyone else was missing, to walk into a room and understand in 30 seconds which person was lying, which alliance was cracking, which handshake carried the weight of a genuine agreement, and which was theater. He had been wrong about nothing consequential in 25 years. The diagnosis had come in the spring of his 36th year, during a period when the thought of continuity, of an heir, of a legacy that extended past his own mortality, had first become a real consideration. He'd been seeing a woman named Laura, serious enough that the question of a future had genuinely appeared on the horizon, and he'd made an appointment, almost clinically, the way he handled all things that required concrete answers, because he wanted to know what he was working with. Dr. Nathaniel Rourke had been his physician for 4 years by that point. A small, precise man, immaculately dressed, operating out of a private practice on the Gold Coast that catered to exactly the kind of clientele who needed discretion above all other qualities. Rourke had reviewed the results with him in a sitting room, not an examination room, never the cold sterility of a medical space, always the warmer setting Rourke preferred, which Damien had always read as a kind of respect. The results, Rourke had said, were unambiguous. A condition present from adolescence, likely undetected due to the asymptomatic nature of it. Not treatable in a meaningful way, not reversible. The chances of natural conception were statistically negligible, a term Rourke had used with a slight apologetic pause before it, as if the pause itself constituted condolence. Damien had thanked him, finished his coffee, and driven back to the office. He'd told Laura 2 weeks later. She'd cried. They'd separated 6 months after that, for reasons that were never entirely about the diagnosis, but weren't entirely unrelated either. He'd put the information away, the way he put things away that required acceptance rather than action, and he'd moved on. 15 years. He sat in his darkened living room and turned that number over like a stone. The idea that the foundation was wrong, not his foundation, not his character, but the single clinical fact around which he'd organized 15 years of expectations and choices and quiet grief he'd never named, felt structurally disorienting in a way he didn't have words for. He picked up his phone at 12:30. He called a number he reserved for things that could not wait for morning. "I need everything on Dr. Nathaniel Rourke," he said when the line connected. "Records, credentials, financials, professional associations, everything you can pull. I need it by morning." He paused. "And I need it clean," he added. "Quiet. Nothing that leaves a trace." He ended the call and set the phone down and looked at the broken crystal on his floor, the scattered light catching the edges of each piece. He didn't pick it up. He left it there, like evidence. The package arrived at Vivian's firm at 9:15 the following morning, before she'd even cleared her email. The receptionist brought it to her desk without comment. A manila envelope, her name printed on the front in clean block letters, no return address. Inside was a single document, 12 pages, photocopied from what appeared to be a medical file. The pages were slightly yellowed at the edges. At the top of each page was a header she didn't recognize immediately, a practice name she didn't know, and a patient identification number. She turned to the last page. The patient name had been redacted, but the physician's signature at the bottom had not. Dr. N. Rourke. She read the document slowly, twice, at her desk while the office filled up around her and her assistant knocked to ask about a site meeting she'd forgotten to reschedule. The language was clinical and technical in places she couldn't fully follow, but the sections she could follow were clear enough. The file was a medical record. The assessment it contained documented a fertility evaluation conducted 15 years prior. The conclusions in the body of the document, however, did not match the conclusions in the summary page at the end, the page that would have been shown to the patient. The body said, "Findings inconclusive, further evaluation recommended." The summary page said, "Diagnosis confirmed, condition non-reversible." They were not the same document. Someone had swapped the summary page. Vivian sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Damien. He answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been holding the phone. "I received something this morning," she said, "from Rourke's office, I think, or someone with access to his files." Silence. Then, "So did I." "What did you get?" "Financial records. A payment trail." His voice was very controlled. She'd learned to hear the things inside that control, the tight wire of anger underneath the surface, the thing straining to keep itself from snapping. "Someone wired money to a numbered account registered to Rourke 15 years ago. The originating account is under a shell corporation. I'm having it traced." "Damien, the document you received, the medical file." "Yes?" "The summary page doesn't match the body." "No." She paused. "Someone changed what you were told." The silence stretched long enough that she counted it. "Yes," he said finally. The word sounded like something being pulled out by its root. She heard him breathe. She heard, in that breath, something she hadn't heard from Damien Moretti in 8 months of knowing him. Something raw and shapeless. Something that had been stored somewhere too long in a container that wasn't meant to hold it. Something that was not anger, was not strategy, was not the controlled machinery of a man who built empires and ran them without flinching. It was grief. It sounded exactly like grief. "I'll come to you," he said. "I don't know if that's not to ask anything. I'm not coming to ask you for anything." His voice tightened. "I need to show you what I found. And I need to—" He stopped. Started again. "I need you to understand that I didn't know." She closed her eyes. "I know you didn't," she said quietly. She heard him exhale. 2 hours, he said. "All right." She hung up the phone and sat at her desk and looked out the window at the November sky, which was the color of steel, flat and cold and ungiving, and she thought about a man who'd been handed a lie and carried it alone for 15 years because no one had told him he was carrying anything but the truth. She thought about the child. She pressed her palm against her stomach, very lightly, the way she'd been doing for 3 days now, half habitually, half deliberately, grounding herself in the specific, undeniable physical reality of this thing, this impossible, actual, apparently not impossible at all thing. 8 weeks. Strong heartbeat. She thought about the word impossible and what it meant when the foundation of it turned out to be a fabrication. She thought about who would do that. Who would fabricate something so specific, so targeted, so personal? Who would want a man to believe he could never have an heir badly enough to purchase a doctor's lies and insert a false summary page into a medical file and leave the whole thing buried for 15 years, waiting? She thought about the word waiting. Whatever had been buried was surfacing now. She thought about this phone call the night before. The information is time-sensitive. Someone had wanted her to have that file. Someone had sent it at the right moment, with deliberate timing, which meant someone had been watching, which meant the document arriving in her hands was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Titch. Damien arrived at her apartment building at 11:45. She watched him through the peephole before opening the door, a reflex she'd developed over the past 3 days, checking the shape of the world before letting it in. And what she saw was a man who looked like he hadn't slept. It was notable because Damien Moretti had, in her experience, never looked like a man who hadn't slept. He looked like a man who had decided not to need sleep, which was different. He looked like a man who had identified sleep as a variable he could manage and had managed it efficiently. But the man standing outside her door had shadows under his eyes and a stillness about him that wasn't controlled. It was exhausted, which was entirely different and entirely more human. She opened the door. He came in without touching her, which she noted. He sat down at her kitchen table, which she also noted. Not the living room, not the couch, the kitchen, where the light was practical and the seating was functional and there was nowhere to perform anything. He set a folder on the table. "Sit down," he said. Not a command. A request. She sat. He opened the folder. For the next 40 minutes, he walked her through it. The payment trail, the shell corporation, the cascade of financial records that his investigators had pulled overnight and that he'd been reading since 4 in the morning. The numbers were clean and damning. 3 separate wire transfers, all originating from the same holding company, all routed to the same account, all dated within a 40-day window 15 years ago. The holding company was a subsidiary. The subsidiary traced back to a man named Vincent Moretti, Damien's uncle. Vivian watched Damien's face while he said the name. She watched the particular quality of stillness that came over him, the kind that wasn't peace, but was the thing you constructed very carefully in the absence of peace, when the alternative was coming apart in someone else's kitchen. "Your uncle," she said. "My father's brother." He kept his eyes on the documents. "He managed significant parts of the family's interests during the period when my father was transitioning power. He had standing and influence that he considered essential to the operation of the enterprise." A pause. "He considered an heir, a direct heir, a biological one, a threat to that standing, because a real heir would eventually consolidate power away from him." "Yes." Vivian looked at the documents, the dates, the dollar amounts, the names. "He bought 15 years, she said. Damien didn't answer immediately. "He bought 15 years, she said again, quietly, not as a question this time. "Yes," Damien said. His voice was very controlled. She watched his hands on the table, both flat, both still, both pressed against the surface with a slight, barely perceptible pressure that told her what the voice would not. "The woman who called me last night," Vivian said. "The one who sent the file. Someone inside Rourke's practice." Damien finally looked up. "I believe Rourke has been living with this for 15 years, and I believe he made a decision recently to—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is what it means. It means your diagnosis was fabricated." "Yes." Which means everything I believed about myself for 15 years was—" He stopped again. This time the stop was longer. He looked down at the table. She watched the line of his jaw and the way it worked, the way he was doing something very deliberate with his breathing, something that was costing him. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She hadn't expected that. "Last night," he said. "What I said, what I implied." He raised his eyes to her. "I was wrong, and I am sorry." The quality of his apology was not smooth. It was not practiced. It came out jagged and slightly undone, like a man who had been turning the words over since the moment she'd walked out his door and hadn't found a better arrangement for them. Just this one, blunt and imprecise and real. She felt the tightness in her chest ease, very slightly. "You had 15 years of certainty on the other side of it," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but it's a context." He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, the architecture fell away. Not his architecture, not the controlled surface and the managed expressions, but the architecture between them, the careful positioning they'd both been doing since last night, the distance maintained for self-protection, and the geometry of two people who'd been hurt and were circling the wound. It fell away, briefly, and what was underneath it was the thing she'd been looking at for 8 months, the man with the reading glasses, who asked smart questions, who'd stood very still outside her car door on a cold Wednesday night and given her every chance to step back. She hadn't stepped back then. She wasn't sure what to do now. "There's more," he said. He tapped the folder. "The Shell Corporation, the subsidiary that processed the payments. It's dormant. But the holding structure it's nested in is not." He looked at her steadily. "Vincent is still active, quietly, peripherally. But he has people who are loyal to him in positions I didn't fully account for because I believed he'd accepted a reduced role." His voice went very flat. "I was wrong about that as well." Vivian understood immediately what he was saying. "He's going to find out, you know," she said. "He may already." "The phone call last night." "Yes. If Rourke moved, Vincent will know Rourke moved, which means Vincent knows the file is out." He paused. "Which means he knows I know." Vivian looked at him. "And what does that mean for us?" she asked. He held her gaze, and his answer was very deliberate and very quiet, and it landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. "It means," he said, "that this is not over." Outside her window, Chicago was wrapped in November gray. Low clouds sitting on top of the skyline like a lid, the city below going about its business. Traffic noise, a siren somewhere distant, the specific indifferent energy of a city that did not pause for anyone's private reckoning. Vivian sat at her kitchen table across from a man who had just discovered that the foundational lie of his adult life had been purchased by someone sitting inside his own family, and she thought about the child inside her, 8 weeks old and already the center of a war that had started 15 years before either of them had any idea it was coming. She thought about the word time-sensitive. She thought about whoever had decided, after 15 years, that now was the moment to pull the buried thing into the light. She thought about what Vincent Moretti, a man she had never met, a man who operated quietly from the periphery of an empire he'd tried to control with a forged medical record, would do now that the thing he'd buried was uncovered. And she thought about the fact that Damien, sitting across from her with his hands flat on her kitchen table, had just told her this was not over, had said it with the voice of a man who was calculating the shape of what came next, the way she calculated the shape of a building before she put a single line on paper. She understood then that what she'd thought was an ending, the confrontation in the penthouse, the shattered glass, the words "that's impossible," had been something else entirely. It had been an opening. And somewhere in this city, on the periphery of an empire built on 15 years of stolen certainty, a man named Vincent Moretti was opening something too. Her phone buzzed against the table. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number again. Not the same one as last night. Different digits, different area code, but the same deliberate chosen timing. She looked up at Damien. He was already watching her. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. Something shifted in his face, fast, controlled, but she caught it. "Don't answer it," he said. She left the phone face down on the table. In the hallway outside her apartment, she could hear the elevator arriving, the soft, mechanical slide of the doors opening and closing. Normal building sounds, normal city sounds, nothing from the outside to indicate that anything was wrong. Damien reached across the table and closed the folder. His hand was very steady. "We need to move," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Both of us," he said. "Now." Damien was already on his feet before she'd finished reading his face. He moved through her apartment with the particular efficiency of a man who had assessed the dimensions of a space the moment he walked into it. Not consciously, not as an exercise, but the way breathing was not an exercise. The way it simply happened because it had been happening long enough to become involuntary. He crossed to her window and stood to the side of it, not in front of it, and looked down at the street below with his back angled against the wall. Vivian watched him do all of this from the kitchen table. "You're scaring me," she said. "Good," he said. "You should be a little scared." "That is not reassuring." "It's not meant to be." He turned from the window. "How long would it take you to pack what you need for a week?" "I'm not—" "Damien, I have a job. I have a site meeting Thursday. I have a—" "How long?" She looked at him. At the stillness in him, which was not calm. She'd learned the difference over 8 months, had catalogued the specific quality of Damien's stillness when it was genuine versus when it was the lid on something else. This was the lid. 20 minutes, she said. 15. She stood up. She didn't ask more questions because she understood, architecturally, that there were moments when the structure of a situation was better grasped through movement than through interrogation. She went to her bedroom and pulled a bag from the top shelf of her closet, and she packed the way she packed for work trips. Efficiently, without sentiment, only what was functional. She heard him on the phone in the kitchen, voice low, clipped syllables she couldn't fully make out, and she focused on her own hands, on the specific tactile reality of folding a sweater and placing it in a bag, on the ordinary physical weight of practical objects. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noted that. She didn't try to fix it. She was back in the kitchen in 12 minutes. He was off the phone. He looked at the bag, then at her. "Car's downstairs," he said. "Your car?" "A car." He picked up the folder from the table. "Not mine." She didn't ask whose. The car was a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver she didn't recognize. A compact, quiet man in his 50s who acknowledged Damien with a nod and pulled into traffic without being told a destination. Vivian sat in the back seat beside Damien with her bag between her feet and watched the city move past the window and tried to locate herself in the situation she was currently inside. She was pregnant. 8 weeks. She had a site meeting Thursday. She was in a car with a man who believed his uncle had purchased a doctor's lie 15 years ago and was now, apparently, a variable that required defensive repositioning. She pressed her knees together and breathed. "Where are we going?" she said. "A property on the North Shore. It's not connected to me directly." "How not directly?" 3 levels of separation. He glanced at her. "It's clean, Vivian. I'm not asking because I doubt your operational competence. I'm asking because I'm trying to understand the magnitude of what you think is happening." He was quiet for a moment. "Vincent has people," he said carefully. "I've always known he had people, in the way you know a building has a subsurface condition you've documented and filed and moved on from. I believed his influence was historical. I believed he'd accepted his position in the current structure." He paused. "The payment trail I found. It's 15 years old, but the Shell Corporation is nested inside a holding structure that was updated 14 months ago." Vivian turned to look at him. "Updated how?" she said. "New signatory, new authorizing documents. Someone refreshed a dormant structure 14 months ago, and the only operational reason to do that is because you expect to need it." 14 months ago. She ran the timeline. That was 3 months before she'd first met Damien at the zoning commission meeting. "You think he knew I was coming?" she said. "I think he monitors me. I think he has been monitoring me for a long time, and I was arrogant enough to believe a man in his position had accepted that his era was finished." He looked out his own window. "I underestimated him because it was convenient to." She heard the self-indictment in that. She didn't comment on it. "And the woman who called me," she said, "Rourke's person. I think Rourke has been sitting on that file for 15 years, trying to decide whether the risk of releasing it outweighed the risk of holding it." Damien's jaw tightened. "I think he waited too long and ran out of time." "What does that mean?" "Ran out of time." Damien didn't answer. She looked at his profile, the set of his mouth, the thing happening behind his eyes that he was deciding whether to share. "Damien." "Rourke is dead," he said. She felt the sentence land in her body. "When?" "They found him this morning. His office called to cancel his patient appointments." He glanced at her. "The police are treating it as a cardiac event." "Is it?" "A man who decided to expose a 15-year conspiracy doesn't die of a cardiac event the same morning the file reaches its intended recipient." His voice was very flat. "No, it's not." The SUV moved through traffic, and the city outside the window went about its Tuesday morning. Delivery trucks, pedestrians, a school bus stopped at a light with its hazards blinking. And Vivian sat in the back seat and understood that the folder on Damien's lap represented a dead man's last act, and that the phone call she'd received last night had been made by someone who had already understood the risk involved in making it. She thought about the woman's voice, professional cadence, slightly too careful. She hadn't sounded frightened. She'd sounded like someone delivering something they'd been holding for a long time and had finally decided they could no longer keep. "The woman who called me," Vivian said. "She's not safe." "No. We need to—" "I have people looking." He said it in a way that closed the subject without dismissing it, efficiently, the way he closed things when the action was already in motion and discussion of it served no purpose. "Right now, I need you somewhere that isn't your apartment or your firm." She nodded. She looked out the window. She thought about Thursday's site meeting and understood that Thursday's site meeting was not going to happen. The property on the North Shore was a house, not a safe house. Or rather, it was a safe house that had been built to look indistinguishable from the kind of house that belonged to someone wealthy and boring and entirely unremarkable. It sat behind a mature hedgerow off a residential street in Wilmette, 2 stories, neutral paint, a 2-car garage, and a kitchen that smelled like nobody had cooked in it in 6 months. Damien's man, the quiet driver, did a walkthrough of the ground floor while they stood in the kitchen, and then came back and said something to Damien in a low voice that Vivian didn't catch, and Damien nodded, and the man left through the garage. They were alone. Vivian set her bag on the kitchen counter and looked around the room. Clean counters, a coffee maker, a window over the sink looking out at a fenced backyard where a birch tree had dropped most of its leaves onto the dead November grass. "There's food in the pantry," Damien said. "I don't want food." "You should eat." "Damien." She turned to look at him. "I am 8 weeks pregnant, and I am standing in a house I've never been in because a man I've never met may have had a doctor killed, And I would like 5 minutes where we are not operationally focused, please." He stopped. He looked at her. Something shifted in him. She saw it move through him the way a current moved through water, visible in the surface tension rather than the depth. He crossed the kitchen and he did something she had not expected, which was that he sat down on the floor. Not in a chair. On the floor, his back against the cabinet below the sink, his legs out in front of him, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, like a man who had been holding something at a precise measured distance for the past several hours and had finally allowed it to move closer. She looked down at him. Then she sat on the floor beside him. They sat like that for a while, backs against the cabinet, shoulders almost touching, in a kitchen that smelled like nobody lived there, in a city that was quietly rearranging its dangers around them. "Tell me what you're not saying," she said. He dropped his hands from his face. "Vincent came to see me," he said, 8 months ago, shortly after the zoning meeting." She went very still. "He told me he was pleased I was keeping company with someone." Damien's voice was careful, controlled, each word weighed before it landed. "He said it was good, that it suggested stability, that stability was good for the organization." A pause. "I thought he was offering approval. I thought he was being an old man who wanted to feel relevant. But," she said, "but he specifically mentioned that you were an architect, that you worked primarily on commercial projects, that your firm had no prior associations with any of my interests." He turned his head to look at her, and his expression was not easy to read, but she read it anyway. She read the layer of it that was self-directed, that was a man laying a very uncomfortable thing at his own feet. "He knew exactly who you were before I told him anything. He knew your background, your firm, your professional history." Vivian absorbed this. "He ran me," she said. "Yes, before we were anything. Within 2 weeks of the zoning meeting." She thought about what that meant. She thought about the specific architecture of it. A man monitoring his nephew closely enough that a single appearance at a public meeting triggered a background investigation on the other participant. A man who refreshed a dormant shell corporation 14 months ago, 3 months before that meeting. A man who was apparently several steps ahead of a timeline that Vivian had believed was entirely personal, entirely accidental. "He wasn't approving," she said. "No." "He was assessing." "Yes." Damien's voice was very quiet. "I think he was assessing whether you were a problem." "And what conclusion did he reach?" Damien didn't answer immediately. "I think," he said, "that the problem he feared was not you specifically. The problem he feared was what you might produce." He looked back at the middle distance, at the opposite cabinet, at nothing in particular. "And now that problem is 8 weeks old and has a heartbeat, and the file he buried 15 years ago is in the hands of the one person who had the most reason to look at it." Vivian put her hand on her stomach. She did it without thinking, the same way she'd been doing it for 3 days. That reflexive grounding gesture. Damien looked at her hand. He looked at it for a long time, and his face did something complicated and quiet that she didn't try to name. "I should have believed you," he said. "You're saying that a lot." "Because it's the most accurate thing I know how to say right now." She looked at him, at the exhaustion in his face that was not physical, or not only physical, at the specific quality of a man who had been operating on a false map for 15 years and had just been handed the correct one and was in the process of understanding what the discrepancy had cost him, all the terrain he'd navigated wrong, all the distances that had been longer or shorter than they should have been. She thought about the word impossible. She thought about how many decisions he'd made inside the certainty of that word. How many women he hadn't fully opened to. How many conversations about the future he'd conducted with that word as a silent premise. How many moments of longing he'd quietly and efficiently buried because the thing he was longing for was impossible, and he was not a man who wasted energy on impossible things. 15 years. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He looked at her hand again. Then he looked at her face. "Don't make promises right now," she said. "You don't have to say anything. Just..." She stopped. "Just tell me you're not going to disappear into this thing and leave me in this house alone." "I'm not going anywhere without you knowing where I am," he said. "That's a promise I can keep." She nodded. She left her hand on his arm. Outside the kitchen window, the birch tree stood against the November sky. White bark and bare branches, stripped down to its essential structure. Everything that wasn't necessary, already gone. He was on the phone for 3 hours. She heard him from the second floor, where she'd unpacked her bag into a dresser with the careful, practical focus of someone who understood that maintaining ordinary routines inside extraordinary situations was a form of sanity management. She heard his voice through the floor. Not the words, just the cadence, the way it shifted between registers, quiet and controlled in some stretches, flat and very deliberate in others. And once, briefly, something harder and lower that she felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate crackers from a sleeve she'd found in the pantry and looked out the window at the street below, where nothing moved except a neighbor walking a dog with the unhurried pace of someone who had no idea what was happening 40 feet away in a house behind a hedgerow. Her phone rang at 2:15. Her assistant, about Thursday's meeting. She answered it and handled it with a calmness that surprised her, citing a family matter, rescheduling without explanation. And when she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand and understood that she was now making practical decisions inside a situation she had not chosen and could not fully see the edges of. She was also, still, 8 weeks pregnant. She thought about her mother, briefly. Her mother lived in Cincinnati and did not know about Damien and would have opinions about all of this that Vivian was not prepared to receive. She put the phone face down on the bedspread. Damien appeared in the doorway at 2:40. He looked like the 3 hours had cost him something. He leaned against the doorframe and she looked at him and waited. "Marcus Hale," he said. She didn't recognize the name. "Vincent's man," he said. "His primary operative for the past 11 years. Marcus has been running logistics inside my operation in a capacity I approved because I believed he was useful and I believed his loyalty was to the current structure." His voice was very even. "I was wrong. He's been reporting to Vincent for at least 3 years, possibly longer." Damien moved into the room and sat in the chair by the window, not on the bed. A deliberate choice of positioning that she read as him needing the separation, the physical right-angle distance, to say what he was about to say without the proximity making it harder. "Marcus knew about you before I told anyone, which means Vincent knew about you within days of the zoning meeting, not weeks, which means his timeline was faster than I understood. Does Marcus know where we are?" "No. The driver this morning is one of 3 people I trust completely. Marcus doesn't have access to this property." He paused. "But Marcus knows that I know about the payments to Rourke, because I pulled those records through a channel that Marcus has visibility into." She understood. "He knows you found it," she said. "Yes." "Which means Vincent knows." "Yes." "How long ago?" "This morning. Probably within an hour of when I started pulling records." He looked at her steadily. "Which means this morning's conversation in your kitchen happened after Vincent already knew I was looking." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "The second phone call," she said. "The one this morning, just before we left." "Yes." "That was Vincent." "I believe so. Or Marcus acting on his behalf." Damien leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I think the call was not a threat. I think it was a test. He wanted to know if you'd pick up. He wanted to know if I was with you." "What does my picking up or not picking up tell him?" "Whether I've been contained." His voice was flat. "Whether I'm operating on information or emotion." A man operating on emotion picks up an unknown call. A man operating on information lets it go. And I let it go, because I told you to. He held her gaze. He'll read that as me being present, controlled, and in possession of more than he wanted me to have. Vivian pressed her fingers against her forehead. The headache that had been sitting at the base of her skull since that morning had moved forward and was now behind her eyes, the specific weight of too much information metabolized too quickly. "So he knows you know," she said. "He knows you have the file. He knows Rourke is dead, which... Did he? Almost certainly. And he knows we're together." "Yes." "What does he want?" she said. "What is the actual goal here? Does he want you not to have an heir? Or does he want... He wants the empire," Damien said simply. He always wanted the empire. The heir was the mechanism, not the objective. An heir consolidates the succession in a direction that excludes him permanently. That's what he was preventing. He paused. but we're past the point where prevention is available to him. The way he said we're registered in her chest. She looked at him. Damien, she said, what are you going to do? He was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to dismantle every structure he built inside mine, Tess, he said. I'm going to trace every connection, every contact, every funded interest he has inside my operation, and I'm going to remove them. He said it the way she described demolition to clients. Not with appetite, not with aggression, but with the specific precision of someone who understood structural systems and what happened to a building when you removed its hidden load-bearing elements one by one. And then I'm going to sit across from him, and I'm going to have a conversation that ends in one of two ways. Which two ways? She said. He looked at her. The first way, he said, is that he accepts what's happened and steps entirely back. She waited. And the second, she said. He didn't answer. She understood then that he wasn't withholding the answer to protect her from it. He was withholding it because saying it aloud, in this room, in front of her, would make it a declaration rather than a contingency. And a declaration, unlike a contingency, was a point of no return. She looked at him and understood that they were already past the point of no return. They had been past it since she'd said the word pregnant in a penthouse 34 floors above the city. They had been past it since a man named Vincent Moretti had paid for a doctor's lie 15 years ago and buried it under a shell corporation and refreshed the paperwork 14 months ago like someone maintaining a weapon they expected to need. They had been past it since Rourke had finally, after 15 years of carrying it, decided he couldn't carry it anymore, and paid for that decision with his life before breakfast. She looked at Damien Moretti sitting in a chair by a window in a house that wasn't connected to him directly, with 3 levels of separation between this room and his name, and she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't going to walk away from this, not from the fight, and not from her. Both of those things were now the same thing. Her phone buzzed on the bedspread beside her. She looked at the screen. It was a text message from a number she didn't recognize. 7 words, no context, no signature. She talked. They have your firm's address. Damien was across the room and reading the screen before she'd finished processing it. His face went very still. She watched him read it twice. The woman, Vivian said, from Rourke's office. They found her, he said. Not. They got to her. Not. She's been compromised. He said they found her in the past tense, flat and final, and she heard everything that was inside those 3 words that he was choosing not to say out loud. Her throat tightened. My firm, she said. My people are there, Damien. My assistant is... I know. He was already on his phone, already moving toward the door. Stay here. Do not open the door for... I am not staying here while... Vivian. He stopped in the doorway and turned back, and the look on his face was not commanding. It was not the Mafia Boss look, not the look that made lieutenants flinch. It was something more exposed than that, something that had his own fear visible in it for the first time since she'd known him. Please. She stopped. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he was gone, phone to his ear, voice already low and rapid in the hallway, and she was alone in the room with a text message on her phone and a headache behind her eyes and a child inside her that had started all of this, or had been the reason all of this had finally broken the surface after 15 years of pressure building beneath it. She looked at the window. The street outside was quiet. The neighbor and the dog were gone. Somewhere across the city, someone was standing outside the door of her firm with information they'd gotten from a woman who was very probably no longer... The sentence never finished. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed in the house behind the hedgerow and stared at the doorway Damien had just moved through and understood, in the particular way that architects understood incomplete structures, that the thing she was sitting inside right now had no roof yet. She could hear him in the hallway. His voice was low and had gone to a register she hadn't heard before. Not the careful control of a man managing a difficult conversation, but the flat, stripped efficiency of a man issuing instructions that would result in actions she would never fully see or know about. She heard her firm's address. She heard 2 names she didn't recognize. She heard the word now twice, both times with a weight that meant it was not a request. Then silence. Then his footsteps back to the doorway. Your assistant, he said. Elena. Yes? She's not at the office. She texted you this morning that she was working from home. Vivian pulled up her messages. There it was. Elena's text at 8:47, sent before Vivian had even gotten to the office herself, before the envelope had arrived, before any of it. She works from home on Tuesdays sometimes, Vivian said. She's safe. The two people in the office this morning were your project coordinator and a drafting intern. I have someone moving them out of the building right now. He said it the way he said most operational things, as accomplished fact, as done, as a problem already in the process of being solved. They'll be told there's a gas leak. Vivian exhaled. She felt the exhale move through her whole body, all the tension that had been sitting in her shoulders and her jaw releasing slightly with it. Okay, she said. There's more, he said. She looked at him. He came back into the room this time. He didn't sit in the chair by the window. He stood near the dresser, which put him closer to her, and she registered that choice. He was not putting the right angle between them this time. Marcus, he said, I had him pulled in an hour ago. My man Soren picked him up at his apartment. I've been on with Soren while I was in the hall. What did Marcus say? Nothing useful for the first 40 minutes. His jaw was tight. Then something useful. She waited. Vincent doesn't just have Marcus inside my operation, he said. He has 3 others. 2 of them are recent, planted in the last 14 months, around the time the Shell Corporation was refreshed. He paused. The 3rd has been inside for 9 years. 9 years. She did the math automatically, the way she always did. That predates me by years, she said. Yes. Then it's not about me. It was never about you specifically, he said. It was about the eventuality of you, the eventuality of anyone who might... He stopped, reorganized. Vincent has been running a parallel structure inside my operation for 9 years, not to destroy it, to inherit it. He said the last word with a precision that made it sound like what it was. A sentence from a legal document, a word with specific loaded meaning. He was not trying to tear down the empire. He was trying to position himself to absorb it. If I died without an heir, without a designated successor, the consolidation of authority would default to the family's senior member. Which is him. Which is him. Vivian was quiet. She thought about the shape of it, the 9-year patience of it, the infrastructure building of it, the way a man could spend nearly a decade laying quiet groundwork inside a structure he intended to eventually control. She thought about the architectural analogy almost reflexively. It was like building a second load-bearing system inside an existing building, hidden inside the walls, so that when the original structure was removed or failed, the building didn't fall. It simply transferred its weight to the system that had been waiting inside it all along. He's been inside your walls for 9 years, she said. Damien looked at her. Yes, he said, and you didn't know. The words landed. She didn't say them as accusation. She said them as structural assessment, the way she would say to a client you didn't know the rebar was compromised. But she saw them land in him anyway, saw the slight tightening around his eyes. No, he said. I didn't know. Because you trusted the diagnosis. He was very still. Because I trusted the diagnosis, he said. Because a man who believed he would never have an heir had less reason to be vigilant about the specific threat of succession interference. His voice was controlled, but she heard the thing underneath it, the specific self-directed anger of someone who had just identified the exact mechanism by which they'd been made vulnerable. The lie made me complacent about the thing the lie was designed to protect. She understood it completely. It was elegant in the way terrible things were sometimes elegant. The architecture of the deception was structurally sound. Give a man a false certainty, and he will stop guarding the door that certainty protects. Marcus, she said. What did he tell you about the 3rd one? The one who's been there 9 years. Damien's face changed. It was subtle. She almost missed it. A slight tightening, a shift in the quality of his stillness. Damien. He looked at her directly. Soren, he said. She heard the name and did not immediately understand. And then she understood. Soren has been Vincent's man for 9 years. His voice was absolutely flat. The man I sent to pick up Marcus this morning. The man who drove us here this morning. The man I told you was one of 3 people I trust completely. The room was very quiet. Vivian felt the quiet the way you felt a structural failure. Not all at once, but in stages. The first crack, and then the understanding of what the crack meant, and then the sick, dropping certainty of what came next. "He knows where we are," she said. "Yes." "You told him." 3 levels of separation, you said. "You told him this was a clean property." "Yes." She stood up. Her legs were not entirely steady, and she was aware of that, and she stood anyway, because sitting felt wrong, felt like a position of passivity in a situation that had just fundamentally rearranged itself. "How long ago did Soren drop Marcus?" she said. 40 minutes. And Marcus told him nothing useful for 40 minutes. Correct. So 40 minutes ago, Soren was still with Marcus, and then Marcus started talking. Yes. And when Marcus started talking, Soren left, Damien said. Soren left Marcus and has not been reachable since. Vivian looked at the window, the quiet street, the bare birch tree. "He's telling Vincent right now," she said. "Yes. And Vincent knows where we are. He will within the hour, if he doesn't already." She looked at Damien. He was watching her with a focus that was not the kind she was used to, not the focus of a man reading a document or reading a room, but the focus of a man reading a person, reading her specifically, reading whether she was going to hold or fracture under the specific pressure of this moment. She breathed. "Then we can't stay here," she said. "No." "How long do we have?" "Long enough." He moved toward the door. "Get your bag." She already had it. Bad. They went out through the garage on foot, leaving through a gate in the back fence that opened onto a residential alley running parallel to the street. Damien had a phone to his ear before they'd cleared the gate. Different phone, she noticed. A second one she hadn't seen him produce before. A detail she filed without comment. He spoke in short phrases, received short answers, made a sound of acknowledgement, and pocketed it. 3 blocks north, he said. Gray Volvo. Keys under the driver's side mat. Whose car? Does it matter? She walked beside him through the alley, her bag across her body, and she focused on the sound of her own footsteps on the cold concrete and the specific bare tree quality of the November sky above the alley's fence lines. And she breathed steadily, and she did not allow herself to think beyond the next 3 blocks. The Volvo was where it was supposed to be. Unremarkable in the specific way of cars that had been chosen for their unremarkability. She got in the passenger side. Damien drove. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other on his phone in his lap, checking it at stoplights with the quick, habitual efficiency of a man who understood that information moved faster than vehicles. "Where are we going?" she said. "I have an office downtown, not the main one. A secondary location, different entity, not connected to Moretti Holdings." He glanced at her. "Soren doesn't know it exists." "Who else knows it exists?" A pause. 2 people, he said. "One of whom is in it right now, waiting for us." "Who?" "His name is Carver. He's been with me for 22 years. He was my father's before he was mine." He glanced at her again, briefly. "He's the reason I'm not driving toward an ambush right now. He's the one who called me about Soren." Carver knew about Soren. Carver has known about Soren for 6 weeks. Vivian looked at him. 6 weeks, she said. "He was building a case. He wanted to understand the full scope before he brought it to me." Damien's voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man who had accepted a difficult thing because the alternative to accepting it was irrational. "He was right to wait. If he'd brought it to me at week 1, I would have moved on Soren immediately, and Marcus would have gone to ground, and we'd have lost the financial trail before we found it." She understood the logic. She understood it, and she also understood that Carver had been sitting on the knowledge that one of Damien's most trusted people was a plant, while Damien had been operating in the belief that his inner circle was intact. 6 weeks ago, she said carefully. "That was before you came to my apartment." He drove. "Yes," he said. "Carver knew 6 weeks ago that someone inside your operation had a connection to Vincent." "Yes. And during those 6 weeks you came to my apartment. You brought me the documents. You drove to Wilmette this morning in Soren's car." She kept her voice even. Everything that happened this morning, Carver knew was happening inside a compromised situation. He was watching Soren, monitoring the communication. He believed he had enough control over the information flow to manage the exposure. Damien's hands on the wheel were steady. He was managing it. Was he? She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't pull it back. Because we are currently in an unremarkable gray Volvo, running from a house that Soren walked us into this morning. Carver did not anticipate that Marcus would surface information on the same morning that Soren— Damien, she turned in her seat to face him. I understand that there is a logic to how this happened. I understand operational complexity and the management of cascading information, and I understand that you trust Carver for reasons that are 22 years old and presumably solid. She paused. But I need you to understand something in return. He glanced at her. I am 8 weeks pregnant, she said. I left my apartment this morning with a bag I packed in 12 minutes. I have been in 2 vehicles and a house I've never seen, and I have eaten crackers from a pantry. A man is dead. A woman is— I don't know what that woman is, the one who called me, and neither do you. And the person you trusted to drive us to safety this morning was working for the man who has been systematically hollowing out your empire for 9 years. She held his gaze through the next stoplight. I need you to tell me that Carver is the last wall and that it holds. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Carver is the last wall, he said, and it holds. Another beat. It holds, he said. She turned back to face forward. She pressed her palm against her stomach. She said nothing more for the rest of the drive. The secondary office was on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop that had the look of a building where mid-sized accounting firms and healthcare consultancies operated without distinction. The lobby was beige and the elevator was slow, and the hallway on 14 smelled like carpet cleaner. Damien used a key card at the third door on the left. Inside was Carver. He was older than she'd expected, late 60s, heavy-set, with a face that had the weathered, deliberate quality of someone who had spent decades making himself easy to underestimate. He was sitting at a table with a laptop and 2 phones and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. And he stood when they came in, and his eyes went to Vivian first, not to Damien. He assessed her in 2 seconds. She saw it happen. Then he looked at Damien. Soren made contact with Vincent at 11:14, he said. No greeting, no preamble. Vincent moved 2 people within 20 minutes. They went to the Wilmette property first. Damien nodded. I want everything Soren has touched in the last 6 weeks flagged, he said. Every contact, every property, every communication channel he had access to. Already running. Carver sat back down. He looked at Vivian again. Miss Hartwell, I apologize for the circumstances. Which circumstances specifically? She said. Something moved in Carver's face that might have been appreciation. Fair point. He looked at Damien. There's something else. Damien waited. Carver folded his hands on the table. It was a deliberate gesture, sir. She recognized it as the gesture of a man who was about to deliver something he'd been holding at arm's length and had now decided there was no longer any reason not to put it down. The Shell Corporation, Carver said. The one that processed the payments to Rourke. You traced it to Vincent's holding structure. Yes. I ran the signatory on the refreshed documents, the person who signed the updated authorization 14 months ago. Carver paused. The pause was specific, not the pause of a man searching for words, but the pause of a man giving the person across from him one last moment before the thing he was about to say could not be unsaid. It wasn't Vincent. Damien went very still. The signatory is a woman named Claire Moretti, Carver said. She used a secondary identity for the documentation, but the biometric verification on the notarized signature traces back to her legal name. Vivian watched Damien's face. Sheba watched it in the way she watched load-bearing structures when she wasn't sure if they would hold, with the specific focused attention of someone who understood that what was about to happen in the next few seconds would determine the shape of everything that followed. Damien said, very quietly, Claire's been dead for 11 years. No, Carver said. She hasn't. The room was very quiet. Vivian did not know who Claire was. She understood from the specific quality of Damien's stillness that this was not a gap she should try to fill right now. Explain that, Damien said. His voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard before. It had shed the control, shed the management, shed the entire constructed surface of it, and what was left underneath was something raw and very old. Explain what you just said. Claire Moretti is alive, Carver said. She has been living under a protected identity in Portland for 11 years. The identity was established and funded by Vincent through the same holding structure. He didn't just protect her, he built her a life. He paused. And 14 months ago, she used that life to sign the documents that refreshed the mechanism that was used to falsify your medical record. Damien sat down. He sat down in the chair nearest to him with the specific, sudden heaviness of a man whose legs had made a decision without consulting the rest of him. Vivian looked at him. She had never seen him sit like that. She had never seen the structure go out of him that completely. In 8 months of knowing him, through every difficult conversation, through the night she had told him she was pregnant and the glass had hit the marble, through this morning and the drive and the house and all of it, she had never seen him look like this, like something had been removed from the center of him. She's his daughter, Vivian said quietly. Not a question. She said it because the only configuration that produced this particular devastation in a man like Damien Moretti was the kind that came from bloodline. She's his niece, Carver said. Vincent's daughter, Damien's cousin. They told me she died in a car accident, Damien said. His voice was very flat, empty in the specific way of a vessel that had just had its contents poured out. I attended There was a service. I saw... The service was real, Carver said. What it commemorated was not. Vivian watched Damien's hands on the table. Both flat. Both pressing down. The same position they'd been in this morning in her kitchen, but different now. Different pressure, different reason, different kind of weight. Why? Damien said. One word. It carried about 15 years of architecture in it. Carver was quiet for a moment. We don't have the full picture yet, he said carefully. But what the financial trail suggests is that Claire's disappearance was not punitive. Vincent didn't hide her because she'd done something wrong. He paused. He hid her because she'd found something. Damien looked up. The original falsification, Carver said, Rourke's file. We believe Claire found evidence of what her father had done, the payments, the false diagnosis, and Vincent made a decision about what to do with a daughter who knew too much about a crime she couldn't be trusted not to expose. He staged her death, Vivian said. Yes, but he didn't harm her. He relocated her, which tells us something about the man. He was willing to bury his own child's existence to protect himself, but he wasn't willing to do the other thing. Carver looked at Damien. And 14 months ago, Claire used the identity he'd built for her to sign documents that refreshed the mechanism he'd used to ruin you. The room processed this in silence. Vivian understood it in stages. Claire had been hidden by her father to protect a secret. And then, at some point in the last 14 months, Claire had decided, for reasons none of them fully knew yet, to use the tools of her own concealment against the man who had concealed her, the woman who'd called Vivian. Rourke's office, the professional cadence, the careful, deliberate timing. The phone call, Vivian said. Carver looked at her. The woman who called me the night I told Damien I was pregnant, she said. The one who sent the file to my firm. Carver was quiet for a moment. We believe so, he said. She wasn't from Rourke's office. She may have had access to Rourke's office, but no, we don't believe she was his employee. Vivian looked at Damien. Damien was looking at the wall. He was looking at the wall the way a man looked at something that wasn't there. At the negative space of something, at the outline of an absence, at the place where a thing had been before it was taken. A cousin he'd mourned for 11 years, a lie that had been waiting inside his own family for 15. A woman who had decided, apparently, that the moment Vivian Hartwell walked into Damien Moretti's life and produced an impossible pregnancy was the moment the buried thing needed to surface. Vivian thought about the word time-sensitive. She thought about why, of all the moments in 15 years, Claire Moretti had chosen this one. She thought about what it meant that a woman who had been erased by her own father had spent 11 years building the patience to dismantle the lie that erased her, and had pulled the trigger the moment a child entered the equation. She thought about the child. She pressed her palm against her stomach, and she looked at Damien looking at the wall, and she thought about what this meant, not just for the Empire, not just for Vincent and the 9-year infiltration and the shell corporations and the people who had been moved this morning in the direction of a house in Wilmette, but for the specific human being sitting across from her, who had just discovered that the cousin he'd grieved for 11 years had been alive the whole time, building toward this moment, and had lit the fuse herself. Carver's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted in a way that was very small and very controlled, but she caught it. "What?" Damien said. He'd come back. She watched him come back from wherever he'd gone, watched the structure reassemble itself, not fully, not the way it had been before Carver said the name, but enough. Carver turned the phone so Damien could see the screen. Damien read it. She watched his face. What moved across it was not anger. It was not fear. It was something more fundamental than either, the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the situation he thought he was managing has been, the entire time, managing him. Damien stood up. He stood up with the specific controlled speed of a man who had made a decision in the half-second it took to read 7 words on a phone screen, and the decision had reorganized everything. The posture, the eyes, the quality of the air immediately around him. "He has Claire," he said. Carver didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The message on the screen was already doing that. Vivian stood too. "What does it say?" Damien handed her the phone without looking at her, his eyes already on Carver, already in the next 30 seconds, rather than this one. She read it. She came to me. "Ask your man what that means. The rest is your move." No signature, no number she recognized. "Vincent." "He's telling you he has her," Vivian said. "He's telling me she went to him," Damien said, "which is different." She looked at him. "Claire went to Vincent voluntarily," he said. His voice was very controlled, the kind of controlled that costs something. "He didn't take her. She walked back in." Carver was already on his laptop. The message came from a burner registered in Evanston. Tower ping puts it 4 miles north of the loop, sent 11 minutes ago. "The lakeside property," Damien said. Carver looked up. "You think he's at the—" "He's been at the lakeside property since this morning. It's the only holding that isn't nested inside the corporate structure I can touch." He moved toward the door. "It's old family. It predates everything. He knows I can't approach it through any channel that leaves a record." "Damien," Carver's voice went firm, "you cannot walk into that property tonight. He has at minimum 4 people, sir. If Soren reached him, possibly 6. The location is isolated, and he chose it specifically because I know why he chose it. Then you know that walking in there is exactly what he wants." "Yes." Damien stopped at the door and turned back. He looked at Carver with the expression of a man who had already run the calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't particularly like, but was going to use anyway. "And I'm going to give him what he wants, because the only leverage I have left is that he doesn't know how much I know, and he needs me to come to him to find out." Carver was quiet. "He sent that message to my phone," Damien said, "through Soren's channel. He knows this number. He's been reading this number for 9 years. He held Carver's gaze. "Which means everything I've said on this line for 9 years, he's had." The room went very still. Vivian understood what that meant a full second before Carver said it. "Everything," Carver said quietly. "Everything." Damien looked at her now, and his eyes were different, cleared out, stripped of the layer of management and the layer beneath that, down to something essential and very direct. "Which means he knows this building. He knows we're here." She held his gaze. "How long?" she said. "Since Soren made contact this morning." He looked at Carver. "This office is burned. We have maybe an hour before his people confirm the location." Carver was already closing the laptop. Damien looked at Vivian. "You're not coming with me," he said. She opened her mouth. "Don't," he said, not commanding, asking. The word had the same quality as the pleas in the upstairs hallway, back in Wilmette. The specific exposed quality of a man making a request rather than issuing an order because he understood, at this particular moment, that he had no authority to issue one. "I need you somewhere I don't have to think about. Somewhere the only variable I'm managing is the one I'm walking toward." She looked at him for a long moment. "Where?" she said. "Carver will take you." "Where, Damien?" "Somewhere Vincent has never had a reason to look." He moved to the table and took a key from his jacket pocket. An ordinary key. House key. The kind you had cut at a hardware store. And he set it on the table in front of her. "Apartment on Dearborn. It's in a name that has no connection to me, to Moretti, to any holding or subsidiary or associated entity. I signed the lease myself, in person, in cash, 11 years ago. His voice did something on 11 years ago that he controlled immediately. I've never told anyone about it, not even Carver. Carver looked at the key. You've had a clean address for 11 years, Carver said. Yes, and you never used it. I always intended to need it eventually. He picked the key up and held it out to Vivian. The address is on the tag. She took the key. His hand was warm. Her fingers closed around the key and his hand for a moment, and neither of them made a production of it, but neither of them pulled back immediately either. Come back, she said. He looked at her directly. Yes, he said. He let go of her hand. He picked up the second phone, not the primary, and he walked out the door, and she stood in the office with Carver and the cold coffee and the closed laptop and listened to his footsteps move down the hallway, unhurried, certain, the footsteps of a man who had decided exactly what he was walking toward. The lakeside property was 40 minutes north of the loop on a narrow road that ran along the water and served, in summer, as a scenic route, and served in November as a corridor of stripped trees and gray water and the specific desolation of a landscape that had given up pretending to be welcoming. Damien drove himself. One car, no escort, which was either the most dangerous decision he'd made tonight or the most tactically sound one. And the difference between those two things was currently sitting on a razor's edge that he was choosing not to examine too closely while operating a vehicle at 70 miles per hour on a dark road. He thought about Claire. He had 11 years of thinking about Claire behind him, but that thinking had always been the particular thinking you did about the dead, circumscribed by the finality of it, bounded by the fact of the ending, a kind of thinking that allowed you to preserve a person in the form they'd last taken without the complication of wondering how they'd changed. Claire at 28, the last time he'd seen her. Claire with her mother's dark eyes and her father's deliberateness and the specific quality of attention she'd always had. The way she listened to a room before she spoke in it. She had found out what Vincent had done. She had been 28 years old, and she had found out, somehow, that her father had purchased a doctor's lie to prevent her cousin from ever having a child. And she had, what? Confronted him? Threatened to tell Damien? Done something that made Vincent decide that the only available response was to make her disappear so completely that her own family spent 11 years placing flowers on an empty grave. He thought about the phone call to Vivian. He thought about Claire sitting in Portland for 11 years, watching, waiting for the moment, waiting for the specific configuration of events that would make a move possible, a move that required, apparently, a pregnancy, a confrontation, a shattered glass, and a file delivered to the right hands at the right moment. She had been patient in a way that he was only beginning to understand the full dimensions of. The lakeside property appeared on his left, a long gravel driveway behind iron gates, the gates standing open, which told him Vincent had expected him. The house at the end of the drive was large and dark except for the ground floor, where 3 windows showed light. Old stone exterior, slate roof, the kind of house that had been built to demonstrate permanence and now demonstrated mostly vacancy, a building that had outlasted the purpose it had been built for. Damien parked at the end of the drive and got out of the car. The cold hit him immediately. The specific lake effect cold of the North Shore in November, wet and direct, the kind that found the gap between collar and jaw and settled there. He stood for a moment beside the car and looked at the lit windows and the open gates and the absolute darkness of the water beyond the property line. And he breathed, and he let the cold do what cold did, which was make everything in the body more precise. Then he walked to the front door and opened it. The entry hall smelled like dust and old wood and the ghost of a fire that had been lit days ago and had long since gone cold. The chandelier overhead was not lit. The light came from the room at the end of the hall, visible through an open doorway, warm and localized. 2 men stood inside the entry hall. He recognized one of them as Marcus's replacement, a compact man named Dell, whose body language said armed in 3 different ways simultaneously. Dell nodded at him. That was all. No search, no words. Vincent had calculated correctly that a man walking into this house voluntarily was not a man carrying something he intended to deploy inside it. He was right. Damien walked past Dell and down the hall and through the doorway. The room was a study of some kind, large, with the accumulated furniture of several decades, none of it matching, all of it heavy and dark. A fireplace had a fire in it, recently built, aggressively orange against the cold seeping through the old windows. Bookshelves with books nobody had read in 20 years. A desk that served as a surface for 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon that had not been opened. Vincent Moretti sat in a chair near the fire. He was 73 years old and looked 65 and carried himself like 60, which had always been his particular quality. A man who had managed to keep the physical impression of vigor past the point where the actual substance of it remained. He had gray hair gone almost white at the temples, his brother's jaw in a softer configuration, and eyes that were a color Damien had always struggled to name. Not quite brown, not quite green, the color of something organic that had dried to a different shade than its original. He looked at Damien coming through the doorway, and he did not stand, which was deliberate. Both men understood it was deliberate, and neither man commented on it. "Sit down," Vincent said. "I'll stand," Damien said. "Suit yourself." He gestured toward the bourbon. "Drink?" "No." "Then let's not perform hospitality." He folded his hands in his lap. "You found the payments?" "Yes." "Rourke." "Dead." A slight tightening around Vincent's eyes. Not surprise. The absence of surprise. "He made a choice." "He made a choice 15 years too late," Damien said. "And you made sure it cost him." Vincent didn't confirm or deny that. He looked at the fire for a moment. "Where is she?" Damien said. "She's here." Vincent looked back at him. "She came to me this morning, which surprised me, if I'm being honest. I didn't expect her to move this directly." "What did she want?" "She wants what she's always wanted, to end this." He said it simply, without weight, the way he said everything, with the specific economy of a man who had long since decided that the texture of language was a distraction from its function. "She believes that if you and I are in the same room, I'll accept the reality of the situation." "She's right." "Is she?" He looked at Damien steadily. "And what is the reality of the situation as you understand it? You paid Rourke to falsify my diagnosis. You spent 15 years operating inside my organization through 3 compromised employees, the most recent of which I placed in a position of significant trust because you'd spent 9 years making him appear trustworthy." Damien kept his voice level. "You staged your daughter's death to prevent her from telling me what you'd done. You refreshed the operational structure 14 months ago because my relationship with Vivian Hartwell changed your timeline." He paused. "And now you're sitting in this room waiting to find out how much I know and what I intend to do with it, because a man who's been managing uncertainty for 15 years still wants to understand the shape of the thing before he decides how to respond to it." Vincent looked at him for a long moment. "You've had a full day," he said. "Tell me why," Damien said. The simplicity of it landed differently than a complex accusation would have. He watched it land. He watched Vincent process the simplicity of it. 2 words, a question a child would ask. And in a man like Vincent, the question a child would ask was frequently the most disorienting one, because it stripped away all the language of strategy and left only the human thing underneath. Vincent looked at the fire. "Your father was sick," he said, 2 years before he died. Not the way he told people. Not the managed illness, the controlled decline he presented. The real version. The version where the timeline was 18 months, maybe 24, and the organization was going to transition before anyone was ready for it to transition. He paused. "You were 36. You were exceptional at what you did, but you were not what the organization needed in that moment. You were too direct, too impatient with the people who required management rather than directives. So you bought me 15 years of believing I had nothing to pass on," Damien said. "You bought yourself 15 years of influence by making me believe the question of succession was irrelevant." "I bought the organization 15 years of stability," Vincent said. His voice did not rise, but there was something in it, not defensiveness, something more like the specific tone of a man who has been rehearsing a justification for so long, it has calcified into something he actually believes. "You were not ready, and a ready organization with an unprepared leader is a catastrophe I had watched happen twice in my lifetime. I was not willing to watch it happen a third time. So you decided, alone, without telling anyone, without asking anyone. Decisions made alone are the only decisions that hold. Claire found out." The fire popped. Something shifted in Vincent's face, very small, very fast, the thing that happened when a man's armor was touched at an undefended point. Claire was 28 years old, and she found a copy of the original report in Rourke's files, which Rourke should never have kept. His voice went flatter. She confronted me. What did she say? She said she was going to tell you. He looked at his hands. She said a man had the right to know what had been taken from him. She used those words, taken from him. A pause. She was very certain. She was right. She was 28, Vincent said, and there was something in it that was not contempt, was the opposite of contempt, was something closer to grief poorly managed, the grief of a man who had done an irreversible thing for a reason he believed was sufficient and had been living with the insufficiency of that reason ever since. She didn't understand what telling you would have done. To the organization, to the timing, to the entire structure that your father and I had spent 30 years. What did you do to her? Damien said. Silence. What did you do to her, Vincent? I protected her, he said. She was my daughter. I protected her the way I protect everything, by making it impossible to be touched. He looked up. She has a house, a name, a life that is entirely hers. I funded it. I maintained it for 11 years. She's been living as a ghost for 11 years because you decided her conscience was inconvenient. Her conscience would have destroyed... She called Vivian, Damien said. His voice went low. She sent the file. She waited 11 years, and she chose the moment a child was involved, and she spent the last 14 months building the mechanism that would surface what you buried. He looked at his uncle. You protected her into a prison, and she spent 11 years finding the key. The fire burned. Vincent sat with that in the specific stillness of a man who had known it was coming and had not found, in all the time he'd had to prepare, a position from which it felt survivable. Where is she? Damien said. Upstairs. He turned for the door. Damien. Vincent's voice stopped him. He turned back. The old man had not moved, had not stood, was still sitting with his hands folded, but something in his face had changed. The management had come down, very slightly, and what was under it was not what Damien had expected. I want you to understand that I never intended. The diagnosis was a delay, not a permanent condition. I intended to revisit it, to introduce the correction, when I believed the timing was... Don't, Damien said. When the organization was sufficiently... Stop. The word hit the room like a closed fist. Vincent stopped. Damien looked at him. At the 73-year-old man in the chair by the fire, with the white temples and the managed posture and the 15 years of justification stacked behind his eyes, like files in a drawer he'd been opening and closing for so long the mechanism had worn smooth. A child is growing, Damien said. Right now, tonight, in a woman who drove to my building in November to tell me the truth, and I threw a glass at my own wall because you spent 15 years making me believe the truth was impossible. His voice did not rise. It went lower. You took that from me. You took 15 years of it and you put it in a shell corporation and you called it strategy and you told yourself it was for the organization, and none of that, not one word of it, changes what it was. Vincent said nothing. Damien turned back to the door. The hallway was empty. Dell had moved or been moved in the time Damien had been in the room, and he registered that as a variable he'd need to account for but didn't stop for. He moved toward the staircase at the end of the hall. The stairs were old, dark wood, the kind that announced each footstep with a specific creak that had been announcing footsteps on these stairs for 50 years. He went up without hurrying. At the top was a hallway with 3 doors, 2 closed, 1 open, and through the open one was light. He went to the open door. Claire was sitting on a windowsill. She was 41 years old and had the specific quality of someone who has spent a long time being very careful. Careful with her expressions, careful with her stillness, careful with the amount of space she occupied in any given room. She was thinner than he remembered, and her hair was shorter, and she had the dark eyes he had always associated with the version of her that existed in his memory, which had been, for 11 years, the only version available to him. She looked at him the way someone looked at a person they had rehearsed seeing, and then found, in the moment, that rehearsal had not adequately prepared them for. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said very quietly, I'm sorry it took so long. He looked at her. She held his gaze. 11 years, he said. His voice was not steady. He didn't try to make it steady. I know. You let me... He stopped. The sentence was too large. There was a service. I know. Her voice held something that had been compressed for a very long time and was releasing very carefully, the way you released pressure from a sealed system, slowly, controlled, because you understood what happened if you didn't manage the rate. I couldn't... He had people everywhere, Damien. If I'd made contact before I had something that could actually end it, he would have known, and the only thing I had was time and patience, and you called Vivian. She looked at him steadily. Yes. You watched. You were watching us. I was watching him. You were adjacent. She pressed her lips together. When I understood she was pregnant, I understood it was the moment, the one thing he couldn't manage away. A child that existed was different from a child that might exist. I needed the file in the right hands before he understood what was happening. Rourke is dead. Her face contracted. I know. I didn't... She stopped. I didn't have more time. He was already moving. He always moves, Damien said. That's what he does. He moves early, and he buries it, and he calls it protection, and he tells himself the architecture holds. She looked at the window, at the dark water beyond the property line, at the November nothing outside. He's my father, she said. I know. That doesn't... She stopped again. Her jaw was tight. It doesn't make it right. I'm not saying it makes it right. I know that too. She turned back to him. Her eyes were dry, which he recognized as a specific kind of effort, the effort of someone who had decided, at some point in the past 11 years, that they had already spent the amount of tears that were available to them on this particular grief. And what was left was something else. Something harder and more durable. What are you going to do? She said. He looked at her. What I should have done 9 years ago, he said, when I first understood his influence hadn't fully receded. She held his gaze. And him, she said. Downstairs, the fire was burning. Somewhere in the house, Dell had repositioned. Damien had noted 2 other variables on the ground floor that he'd filed away and was currently holding with the part of his mind that ran parallel to every conversation. The part that was always simultaneously reading the room and reading the exits and reading the weight distribution of every person in the space. He thought about Vivian in the apartment on Dearborn. He thought about her hand on her stomach. He thought about the word impossible and what it had cost and who had paid for it and in what currency and across how many years. He looked at his cousin, alive, reduced, patient, hers, and he made the decision that he'd been moving towards since 11:14 this morning when a burner phone in Evanston had sent 7 words to a number that had been compromised for 9 years. Stay here, he said to Claire. Don't come downstairs. She looked at him. Damien, Claire. He held her gaze. Stay here. He turned back toward the hallway. He took the stairs down at the same unhurried pace he'd taken them up, each step announcing itself in the dark wood, the old house groaning slightly against the November wind off the lake, the fire visible at the end of the hall as a warm orange shape in the doorway of the study. He reached the bottom of the stairs. Dell stepped out of the shadow of the entrance alcove with his hand at his side, not raised, not a direct threat, but positioned. Reading the return, assessing whether what had come back down the stairs was the same thing that had gone up. Damien looked at him. Step back, he said. Dell looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked past Damien's shoulder at something behind him, and Damien turned, and the hallway at the back of the house had a door in it that was now open, and through that door came the cold and the dark and the sound of the lake, and 2 more men, and between them, with his hands in his overcoat pockets and his white temples and his managed posture, was Vincent, who had not stayed in the study, who had moved through the back of the house while Damien was upstairs, who had positioned himself and his people in the hallway behind his nephew with the specific deliberateness of a man who had been managing variables for 50 years and had not apparently finished managing them yet. I told you to sit down, Vincent said quietly. You should have sat down. The hallway held its breath. Damien stood between Dell in front and Vincent behind, with the cold from the open back door moving through the corridor like something with intent. And he did the thing he always did in the first second of a rearranged situation. He went completely still, and he counted what he had and what he didn't have, and he did it fast because fast was the only available speed. Dell in front, two men flanking Vincent behind. Vincent himself, hands in his overcoat pockets, which meant either nothing or something depending on what was in the pockets. And Vincent was a man who had spent 50 years making those two options indistinguishable. 4 people. 1 hallway. Old house, stone exterior, November wind, lake behind it. And upstairs Claire, who he'd told to stay there. "You moved," Damien said. Not accusation, observation. He turned slowly to face Vincent, which put Dell at his back, which was not a comfortable position and was also the only position available if he wanted to face the variable that mattered. "I've always moved," Vincent said. "That's what you never fully credited me with. You saw an old man accepting a reduced role. I was never reduced." He took his right hand from his pocket. Empty. He held it out to the side in a gesture that was partly reassurance and partly performance. The gesture of a man who understood optics even in a hallway with no audience. "I want to talk. That's all this is." You positioned 3 armed men in a hallway to talk. I positioned 3 men because you came here alone, which means either you're very confident or you're very desperate, and I've learned not to assume which one until I understand the room. Damien looked at him. "Then understand the room," he said. "Your network inside my operation is finished. Every person Marcus named, every communication channel Soren had access to, every funding structure nested inside the holding company. I've had Carver running dismantlement since this afternoon. By tomorrow morning, there is nothing left of what you built inside mine." He said it without heat, without the anger that had been sitting in his chest since this morning, because the anger had gone somewhere else, had converted itself the way strong materials converted stress, into something load-bearing rather than destructive. "The financial records are documented and held by a third party with instructions I gave before I drove here. If I don't make a call by 6 in the morning, those records go to people who will know exactly what to do with them." Vincent's face was very still. "And Claire's testimony," Damien said. "She's been living under a protected identity you funded. She has 11 years of documentation, everything she knows, everything Rourke told her before he died. It's already recorded, and it's already somewhere you can't reach it." The 2 men flanking Vincent looked at their employer. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Damien caught it. The slight reorientation of people who are reassessing the weight distribution of a situation they believed they'd entered with a structural advantage. "So," Vincent said. Quiet, careful. "You came here to tell me it's over." "I came here," Damien said, "because you have Claire in this house, and I wasn't going to leave her here." Something crossed Vincent's face. The armor, which had been impeccable all night, showed a seam. Just one. Just for a moment. The specific seam that appeared in men who had organized their entire lives around a particular conviction. In his case, the conviction that what he'd done had been correct, had been necessary, had been the act of a man protecting a structure rather than destroying a person, and had just been shown, at point-blank range, what the conviction had actually produced. A daughter who'd spent 11 years building the instrument of his exposure from the life he'd given her. A nephew who'd driven alone to a dark house on a lake, not to negotiate, not to threaten, but to collect a woman he'd thought was dead. "She came to me," Vincent said. His voice was lower now. Something in it had changed. Not softened exactly, but lost the managed quality, the performance of it. What was left was something older and less constructed. "This morning, she drove here and she knocked on the door, and when I opened it, she stood on the step and she looked at me the way—" He stopped. Damien waited. "The way her mother used to look at me when I'd done something she couldn't forgive," Vincent finished. "She didn't come to fight. She came to look at me." He was quiet for a moment. "I think she wanted to know if I understood what I'd done." "Do you?" Damien said. The question sat in the cold hallway. Vincent looked at him with his 50 years of management and his 50 years of justification and his 2 flanking men and his empty right hand, and something in his face made a decision that Damien could see happening in real time. The decision to stop managing it, at least in this hallway, at least to this particular person, because the person in front of him had driven here alone and was not afraid of him, and that quality of fearlessness was, in this specific moment, the thing that made pretense feel more exhausting than truth. "No," Vincent said. Not completely. A pause. Not enough. It was possibly the most honest thing Damien had ever heard him say. It was also not sufficient, but it was real, and real had a value that Damien was capable of crediting even when it arrived 15 years too late. He looked at his uncle, at the 73 years of him, the white temples and the overcoat, and the two men who were still flanking him but who had, in the last 90 seconds, moved fractionally, almost imperceptibly, into a posture that was less aggressive and more uncertain, because they were reading the room. The way men in their position read rooms, and what they were reading was that the architecture of this confrontation had shifted in a direction their employer had not fully anticipated. Call them off, Damien said, meaning the men. A long pause. Then Vincent nodded. Dell, behind Damien, moved back toward the entrance alcove. The two men flanking Vincent stepped to the walls. The hallway breathed. I want Claire out of this house, Damien said. She can leave whenever she wants. She always could. His voice was flat, not defensive. The flatness of a man stating a technical truth while understanding that the technical truth did not address the actual crime. She couldn't leave as herself, Damien said. That's the distinction you keep failing to make. Vincent said nothing. Damien turned back to the staircase. He climbed it for the second time, each step announcing itself in the old wood. And at the top he went to the open doorway, and Claire was exactly where he'd left her. On the windowsill, her back straight, her hands in her lap, a woman who had spent 11 years developing the posture of someone who could wait out anything. She looked at him. Okay, he said. She stood up. She picked up a bag from the floor beside the window, a single bag, packed with the economy of someone who had been ready to move for a long time. And she crossed the room, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked at his face the way you looked at something you'd been carrying a picture of for years, and were now comparing to the original. You look tired, she said. You look alive, he said. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright for a moment, not quite spilling over, the same specific effort he'd seen before. The practiced compression of someone who had pre-spent their grief and was now operating on whatever came after. I'm sorry, she said again, meaning something different than the first time. Meaning the years of it, the accumulated weight of 11 years of watching from Portland while he navigated a world she knew was compromised and couldn't tell him why. I know, he said. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Not a hug, not yet. They were not in the place yet where the reunion could be what it would eventually become, because the house was still the house, and Vincent was still downstairs, and the November wind was still coming through the back door. But a hand on her shoulder, solid, present, the physical confirmation of here and real, and I see you. She put her hand over his for a moment, then they walked out of the room together. Bow. They left the house at 11:40. Claire got into the passenger side of Damien's car without looking back at the property. He looked back once, at the lit windows, the open gates, the dark outline of the house against the darker water behind it, and then he got in and drove. He called Carver from the road. I'm clear. She's with me. Vincent? In the house. He has his men, and he has his fire, and he has the records I told him you're holding. He kept his eyes on the road. He's not going to move tonight. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we finish the dismantlement. Every connection, every channel, every person Marcus named, and anything Carver's team surfaces on top of that. He paused. Then I'm going to have a conversation with Vincent in a setting that isn't a dark house on a lake. In daylight, with documentation. And it's going to end in one direction or it's going to end in the other. Carver understood both directions without having them named. Vivian, Damien said. She's in the apartment. She called me an hour ago asking if you were alive. What did you tell her? That you were operational. She told me that wasn't what she asked. A pause that contained something close to dry humor, which was the closest Carver ever got. She's fine. She's been fine. She's eating crackers and watching the street from the window, and she sounds like someone who is managing an extraordinary situation with extraordinary composure. Damien looked at the road ahead. Yes, he said. She does that. He ended the call. Claire was looking out her window at the dark lakefront moving past. She sounds like someone worth it, Claire said. She is. The baby. Yes. Claire was quiet for a moment. I listened to that ultrasound description 3 times. The document Rourke's assistant found, the one she read aloud to the appointment transcriptionist. She paused. 8 weeks. Strong heartbeat. She turned from the window to look at him. I thought about all the things that word meant. Strong. After everything. He didn't answer. He drove. I needed it to be a child, she said quietly. Not manipulatively. Plainly, with the honesty of someone who had been carrying a calculation for a long time and was now laying it out in the open because the carrying was over. I needed there to be something that couldn't be managed away, something real and physical and undeniable, because everything else my father had shown me he could manage. Money, records, people, time. She paused. But a child that existed was different. You said that to me upstairs. I've said it to myself about 4,000 times in 14 months. She turned back to the window. I'm sorry it required what it required. Rourke, he said. She was quiet. He was already sick, she said finally. Before my father moved on him. He told me when we spoke in September that he had maybe 8 months. Pancreatic. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. He wanted to do something right before the end. He said that. Something right. He said it like a man who'd spent 15 years knowing the exact weight of what he'd done wrong and had been looking for a scale that could balance it. She paused. I don't know if that makes it better. It doesn't, Damien said, but I understand it. He drove. The city appeared on the horizon, the familiar compression of lights against the low November clouds, and something in his chest responded to the sight of it the way it always responded. The particular complicated ownership of a man for whom this city was simultaneously a home and a responsibility and a weight, and the only landscape in which he fully understood the coordinates of himself. Where will you go? He said. I don't know yet. She said it without distress, with the considered openness of someone who had spent 11 years inside a defined structure and was now standing at the edge of an undefined one and had made some peace with the vertigo of it. Not back to Portland. That chapter is... She shook her head. I'll figure it out. You have people, he said. She looked at him. You have people, he said again. Whatever you decide to do and wherever you decide to do it, you have people. She looked at him for a moment with her mother's eyes in her father's face, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say that the looking didn't already contain. The apartment on Dearborn was on the 9th floor of a building that had no doorman and a lobby with a faded tile floor and a mailbox bank along the left wall, with names on half the slots and blank tape on the other half. Damien had the building code memorized. He'd said it himself 11 years ago, and it had not changed because no one else knew to change it. And the elevator was small and slow and smelled like the particular combination of old building and other people's cooking that was specific to buildings where people actually lived rather than buildings where people performed living. He knocked. The door opened in under 4 seconds, which told him she'd been close to it. Vivian looked at him. She looked at him the way Claire had looked at him upstairs. That comparative, confirming look. Checking the fact of him against the version she'd been holding in her mind during the hours he'd been gone. Her hair was down. She was wearing a sweater he recognized from her apartment, which meant she'd packed it deliberately in those 12 minutes. And that specific detail, that she'd chosen that particular sweater in 12 minutes of deliberate packing, landed in his chest in a way that was not dramatic and was not loud and was simply, quietly, the most grounding thing he'd felt all day. Carver said you were operational, she said. Carver was accurate. That's not what I asked him either. He looked at her. I'm here, he said. She looked at his face, at the specific quality of exhaustion in it, the particular kind that wasn't physical, or wasn't only physical, the kind that came from a long time of carrying something heavy and then spending one extremely concentrated day putting it down. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The apartment was small and clean and almost entirely empty of personality. 11 years of a space that had been maintained without being inhabited, aired out, kept functional, waiting for a use that had not come until tonight. She had set her bag in the corner and put her phone on the kitchen counter and found, somewhere, a glass of water that was sitting on the windowsill next to the chair she'd apparently been sitting in when he knocked. He sat on the couch. He sat in the way he'd sat on the floor of the Wilmette kitchen that morning, without strategy, without managed positioning, simply placing himself in a location and allowing the weight of the day to come down on him the way gravity came down on a structure when you stopped fighting it. She sat beside him, not across, not at the right angle. Beside, with the specific proximity of someone who had decided that the geometry of self-protection was no longer the appropriate geometry for this moment. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Not everything, not the operational details, not the specific mechanics of the dismantlement Carver was running, not the two directions he'd described to Carver on the drive back, but the rest. Vincent and the hallway, and the things Vincent had said and failed to say, and the single moment of honesty that had been insufficient and real simultaneously. Claire on the windowsill with her bag packed and her 11 years of patience. The drive back through the city. Vivian listened without interruption, which was one of the things about her that had always distinguished her from the people he spent most of his time with. She listened the way good architects listen to a client's description of a space, with the whole of her attention, not preparing her response while the words were still arriving, but actually receiving them, letting them land, forming her understanding from what was given rather than from what she'd already decided. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Claire," she said. "Yes." "She's the one who called me." "Yes." "She waited 11 years." "Yes." She looked at the window. The city beyond the glass was doing what the city always did. Indifferent, continuous, its lights their own weather. "She waited until there was a child," Vivian said. "She said she needed something that couldn't be managed away." Vivian put her hand on her stomach. He looked at her hand. "She was right," Vivian said quietly, "about what it meant. A child that exists is different." She paused. "I've been thinking about that all night, sitting here, about the specific difference between a thing that might happen and a thing that is happening." She turned to look at him. "You spent 15 years believing the second thing was unavailable to you." "Yes." "And you made your peace with it." "I thought I had." She looked at him. "Did you grieve it?" she said. The question was direct and quiet, and had the quality of a question that had been present in the room for some time, waiting for the right moment to become audible. He thought about what to say. He thought about the years of it, the way he'd filed it and moved on, and built the architecture of a life that worked within the constraint, that found other forms of continuity, that identified other reasons to build and maintain and endure. He thought about the word heir and all the times it had appeared in conversations about the future of the organization and the way he'd managed those conversations with the efficiency that he'd told himself was practical, and that he understood now, sitting on this couch in this empty apartment, had also been the efficiency of a man who couldn't afford to feel the specific shape of what he'd supposedly accepted. "No," he said. She nodded, very slightly, the nod of someone who had suspected the answer and received confirmation of it. "Then there's going to be a point," she said, "somewhere ahead of us when it comes, when the fact of her the baby, when that lands on top of 15 years of believing she was impossible, and it's going to be—" She paused. "I want you to know that I know that's coming, and I'm not going to be frightened by it when it does." He looked at her. "Vivian, I'm not making a speech," she said. "I'm just telling you a fact, the same way I told you the first fact, in your penthouse, when I probably should have called first, but I didn't because I needed you without the preparation." She held his gaze. "I'm not frightened of the complicated version of you. I've been looking at the complicated version of you for 8 months, and I drove to your building in November with a truth that was going to rearrange everything. So you should understand that I am not a woman who turns away from rearrangement." He was quiet. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. They sat there. The radiator knocked once, the specific sound of an old building doing what old buildings did, complaining about the cold, adjusting, settling into the work of another winter. He reached over and put his hand over hers on her stomach. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. He simply placed his hand there, over her hand, over the 8 weeks and the strong heartbeat and the impossible actual fact of it. And he sat with the weight of his hand there and felt, for the first time since a glass had hit a marble floor in a penthouse 34 floors above the city, that the rearrangement was not only loss, that some rearrangements made space for things that hadn't had space before. 3 weeks later, Vincent Moretti accepted terms. The meeting took place in daylight, as Damien had said it would, in a conference room in a building in the Loop, with documentation on the table and Carver present and a lawyer whose name appeared on no document connected to Moretti Holdings. Vincent came alone. He sat across from Damien, and he looked at the documentation, and he looked at his nephew, and he made the calculation that a man in his position made when the options had been reduced to 2 and one of them was survivable. He signed. He did not speak much. When he did, it was in the specific economy of a man who had exhausted his justifications and understood they had ceased to function as currency. Once, near the end, he said, "Your father would have done the same thing I did." Damien looked at him for a moment. "No," he said, "he wouldn't have." Vincent looked at the table. He didn't argue it. He left the building on foot, alone, and walked north on Michigan Avenue in the December cold with his overcoat and his white temples, and the 50 years of his maneuvering reduced, finally, to the simple physics of a man walking away from a table where he had lost everything he'd spent 15 years protecting. Damien watched him go through the conference room window. Carver came to stand beside him. They watched Vincent diminish into the pedestrian traffic, become one figure among many, become indistinguishable. "What happens to him now?" Carver said. "He lives," Damien said, "in the reduced version he was always afraid of." Carver was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough?" he said. Damien turned from the window. "It's what there is," he said. Claire spent December in Chicago. She stayed in a hotel for the first week and then in a furnished rental that she found herself, in a neighborhood she chose herself under her own name, the real one, the birth certificate one, the name that had been a ghost name for 11 years and was now, incrementally, becoming a real name again. She and Damien had lunch on a Thursday in the second week. A place near the river, ordinary, the kind of restaurant where the lunch crowd was loud enough that 2 people could talk without being heard by anyone but each other. They talked for 3 hours, about their fathers and their father's world and what it meant to have been shaped by that world, and whether the shaping was a sentence or a starting point. They talked about Claire's 11 years, not all of it, not at once, but enough. They talked about the child. At the end, when the restaurant had emptied into the afternoon and the server had brought the check twice without comment, Claire said, "What will you tell her when she's old enough?" He thought about it. "The truth," he said, "the version appropriate to her age, and then the full version when she can hold it." He looked at the window, at the river moving gray and cold outside. "I spent 36 years not knowing what had been taken from me. She's not going to spend any of her years not knowing what she has." Claire looked at him. "You're going to be terrifying as a father," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh in 11 years, and it was exactly the same pitch, the same quality, the same specific laugh that had lived in his memory filed under things that are gone and was now, apparently, reclassifiable. He let it land. He let himself feel it land, which was something he was learning. Not quickly, not easily, but deliberately, the way he learned everything that required real effort, the practice of allowing things to land instead of filing them before they could. On a Thursday in February, Damien arrived at Vivian's apartment at 7 in the evening. She'd moved back to her own apartment in January. He had not argued. He understood, structurally, completely, that a woman who had built her own life with her own hands in a space she'd chosen herself was not a woman who could be asked to remain in a safe house indefinitely, and that her return to her apartment was not a rejection but a restoration, and that the difference mattered. He had been a constant presence without taking up permanent residence. He had attended the appointments and learned the specific vocabulary of prenatal development with the same intensity he brought to contractual negotiations. He had assembled furniture, badly, the first time, and then, well, after studying the instructions with the focus he usually reserved for documents that had legal consequences. He had learned, gradually, that Vivian's way of managing difficulty was to make coffee and stand at her kitchen window and not be spoken to for a specific duration, and he had learned to recognize the duration and honor it, which was its own form of fluency. He arrived at 7 with no announcement, which she had told him once was not her preference, and which he was still in the process of consistently honoring, and he knocked. She opened the door. She was 20 weeks now, the pregnancy visibly present, and she had the specific quality of a woman who was managing a great deal simultaneously and had decided that this was fine, that she was built for managing a great deal simultaneously, and that anyone who suggested otherwise should expect a measured but firm response. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table. She was making tea, and she made it without asking if he wanted any, because she had learned that he didn't drink tea but would hold a cup if it was put in front of him, and the holding of it was a kind of participation. She put a cup in front of him. He held it. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, and he put something on the table in front of her. A ring, small, not elaborate, a quality that was evident without being displayed, the kind of ring chosen by someone who had thought about the person rather than the gesture. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "I know the timing is not," he started. "Don't qualify it," she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the table, in her kitchen, in her apartment that she'd painted herself, under the light of her own choosing, and she looked at him with the complete, unguarded attention she brought to things she intended to understand fully before she responded to them. He looked back at her. He did not look like a mafia boss. He did not look like the feared and enigmatic power at the center of a criminal empire that dominated the city's shadows. He looked like a man who had driven to an apartment at 7 in the evening and put a ring on a table and was sitting across from a woman whose opinion of him was the most consequential variable in any room he'd been in for 8 months. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't asked yet," he said. "I know," she said. "Yes, anyway." Something happened in his face that he did not manage away, that he let happen, which was the practice he was learning, the deliberate allowance of things landing instead of filing them. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and real and slightly undone. The face of a man receiving something he'd spent 15 years believing was structurally unavailable to him. She reached across the table and picked up the ring herself and put it on, which made him exhale something that was almost a sound. The city outside her window was February dark, the specific darkness of a city in the middle of winter that had not yet begun to consider spring, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary with its radiator knock and its coffee maker and the tea going cold between them on the table. She kept her hand on the table. He put his hand over it. Neither of them said anything for a while. Isabella Grace Moretti arrived on a Tuesday evening in July. The room was nothing like a penthouse. It had fluorescent light and the specific institutional smell of hospitals everywhere, and there was a nurse named Patricia who had a practical, warm manner that Vivian had told him twice she appreciated. And there was a chair that he sat in for 11 hours and would have sat in for 100 more without complaint. When it was over, when the room had settled from its chaos into something quieter, when Vivian was exhausted and present, and looking at him with eyes that had seen something he had not seen, and that he understood he would spend the rest of his life trying to partially comprehend, when all of that had happened, the nurse put the baby in his arms. She was very small. He had known, intellectually, that she would be small. He had read about it. He had attended the appointments and received the information. He had understood, on a factual level, the dimensions of a newborn. He had not understood this. He had not understood the specific weight of her, not heavy, barely present on the scale of things, but weighted in a way that had nothing to do with grams, the specific gravitational quality of something that had not existed and now did, that had been impossible and was now undeniably, irrevocably real. She was asleep. Her face was the face of someone who had just completed an enormous journey and had decided, reasonably, that sleep was the appropriate response. He stood by the hospital window with his daughter in his arms, and the July city beyond the glass, lit and warm and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had shifted in this room that would not shift back, and he felt the thing he'd been carrying for 15 years, the specific silent grief of a door he'd believed was permanently closed, the acceptance of that closure, the architecture he'd built around the absence. He felt it release, not vanish, not disappear, as though it had never been. It released the way a structure released when you finally address the load correctly, not by removing the weight, but by distributing it to the places built to hold it. He looked down at the sleeping face of a girl who would grow up knowing exactly what she had, in a world where the people who loved her were not perfect and had never been, in a family assembled from difficult materials by people who had chosen it over the alternatives. Vivian's hand found his arm. He looked at her. She was watching his face with the complete, unguarded attention she brought to things she intended to understand fully. He looked back at the window. At the city below, bright and relentless and entirely ongoing, the city that had held all of this inside it, the penthouse and the shattered glass and the gray Volvo and the house on the lake and the conference room in December and the kitchen table in February and this room, this window, this weight in his arms. He breathed. Outside, Chicago burned beneath the summer sky, warm and indifferent and full of its own noise, knowing nothing about the man at the window or the child in his arms or the 15 years that had preceded this moment. It didn't need to know. The moment didn't require witnesses. It only required what it had. The window, the light, the weight, the woman's hand on his arm, the sleeping face against his chest. The walls had come down. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way walls actually came down? Incrementally, under sustained pressure, material by material, until one day you looked at the space where they'd been and understood that the light had been getting in for a while already, and you hadn't noticed, and that was fine. That was perhaps exactly how it was supposed to happen. Isabella Grace slept on. The city moved, and for the first time in 15 years, the future was not a calculation. It was just the next moment, and the one after that, and all of them, unremarkably, extraordinarily, his.